All right, we're live. A couple of slight technical difficulties making us fashionably 6 minutes late, but just want to say thanks to Bruce for lending us time tonight. Obviously, a well-respected member of the fishing community, a leading scientist in North America for all that we do here, and just a big thank you for joining us and taking all of our unnecessary questions and teaching us a whole bunch of stuff that we need to know.
You're welcome. It sounds fun.
Well, we spent the week kind of rolling through and getting lead up questions. So I do have a whole list of questions were written in by people. We're kind of going to cover a broad range of topics tonight. We're going to talk about early season bass fishing. That's new to Ontario in this area here. I shouldn't say Ontario, but at least to my area. So I have a whole bunch of questions. We're going to cover some hot new products, some tactics, and just some questions about what make fish bite. Of course, we're anglers. That's what we all want to know. So we're going to lead off there and kind of get into it. But our shameless plug for the night, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff centered around American Baitworks. They're a fantastic company. They've got brands like Set the Hook, Halo rods. They've come out with this new BaitFuel, which we're going to touch on later. Peter Savoy has always had one of the leading baits when it comes to Set the Hook, Scum Frog, net bait. The company's just packing in all the best brands and all the best highlights from every technique that you like to use in fishing. So American Baitworks has a lot of exciting stuff going on, and I know they're working with you, Bruce, on developing a whole bunch of things that we're going to get into. But so basically for the night, we've run a promo. If you buy 3 packages of anything with BaitFuel in it, we've got some awesome BaitFuel buffs that the guys at American Baitworks gave to us. So you get that free. You buy 3 packages of this amazing bait that we're going to talk you into, and then you get a free buff on that. And anybody who makes a purchase tonight on Tackle Depot for any order, no matter what is it in it, you're going to get in for a draw to win a Halo bait casting rod. So we'll let you pick the action. This one's a 7.3. It's an awesome one, but you know what? We're pretty lenient there. So if we have it in stock and you want it and you win, we'll switch that out. So, Bruce, how's it going?
Good. Looking forward to questions.
Well, let's. I want to start right into early bass season. So, can you just tell us real quick, how did this come about? We've heard that you had a lot of input. You did a bunch of scientific research. How did early season bass for Zone 20 come about, and what was the purpose behind it?
Yeah. Well. I think that's one of those cases where it's helped for me to be an angler that spends time on the water. And Queens is right next to Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. And now it's been, I think, 7 or 8 years since we started to realize that the season was opening when the fish were still spawning. And early on, there wasn't a lot of people fishing out there, but as people caught on to the big smallmouth that are now in Lake Ontario and realized that the season was open and you could go out and fish those fish while they were visible, we got a lot of fishing pressure during the spawn. And if you think about how you manage and conserve fisheries, the best way to do it is to do it with good science. So we set out on a project that took 4 years on the water, covered a range of sites from the Bay of Quinte down the St. Lawrence River. And I had graduate students out there swimming and observing when the fish were spawning, what stage of the spawn was happening at the different dates for actually 4 years. We published 3 of them. And what it allowed us to do by doing that research was to build models about the exact timing that the fish were spawning out on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River and in the Bay of Quinte. And with that information, you could see that the season was working well in the inland lakes, but there was a real disconnect. The intent of the season was to protect spawning bass and have the season closed while they were spawning. But because these are such large water bodies, they warm really slowly in the spring. And while the fish might have been mostly finished spawning on the back lakes, out on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River, it was actually at the peak of the spawn that the season was opening in the last few years that the season was opening when it did. So That sounds like the hard part, but that was actually the easy part. The hard part was trying to get your science in front of the right people and work with the Zone 20 Council. It's the M&R Council that works for Zone 20 and Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River and the Bay of Quinte. And with the council's help, figure out what to do with that information.
Yeah.
And it was really through the council that different scenarios were developed as to how we could still do what was intended, which was to protect the bass when they were spawning. So have a closed season while they were spawning, but still come out of it with the same fishing opportunities. And so the way it ended up working was that the council came up with a really good strategy to close the season for smallmouth for a couple extra weeks. And that was really the first, to our knowledge, that's the first time in North America that the season for largemouth and season for smallmouth is actually at a different time. So different opening dates. And then the other thing that we realized was that there was a chunk of time in the beginning before the fish were spawning that anglers could actually be out there catching fish before they got ready to spawn. So it took a while, and it took a lot of back and forth, and it went to public consultation. But it finally passed, and in 2021 last spring was the first time that you could be out on the water as soon as you could get your boat out there, and lots of people were catching bass early in the year before they spawned.
We went out and we totally got in on it and tried it, and it was probably one of the if you want a largemouth beatdown, like it was a fun fish. We couldn't believe the size of the fish, how aggressive the fish were, and you didn't have to feel bad doing it. You know, that you catch a fish on a bed and you're I don't know if this is right, but that early season, like it was just smiles for miles. The weeds weren't up. I mean, of course, we're fishing the bay, so it was really neat to try and figure out that season and just see how different the fish are and how big and aggressive. Like it was such an awesome fishing opportunity that I think you guys nailed it with. I'll trade that all day long. I can't wait for the ice to go out, and that's not because I've been on the bench just itching for 4 months. It was just a really fun fishing season. So when we talk about that, what do you know? What can you share with us about early season? I mean, I know we smacked them around on the chatterbait pretty good. We would target shallow spots with hard bottoms. Probably, I'm going to assume the science behind that is that it warmed up maybe a little quicker. But what can you shed or share with us about what to do this spring when that ice goes and we can get out? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of looking for warmer water. I think that it was funny around here to watch people try to figure out what the fish were doing. And a lot of people started where they thought they were wintering and ended up, I think most people found fish close to spawning areas. They weren't spawning. They were often in big groups. At least the smallmouth were around Kingston. So that when you found fish, you usually found a lot of them and found a lot of big ones. And that's consistent with the research that we were doing when we would see fish staging out in the big lake. We would see hundreds of fish sometimes staging out in the big lake. So I know my experience and the experience of people that I had took a couple days to figure out what the fish were doing. But when you finally patterned it and got onto it, it was a lot of fun. And the fish were big and in good shape.
Yeah. I remember a couple spots going out with a buddy, and we're just like that we gotta leave. Like this actually just feels wrong because we're catching them and it's so easy. Like we're getting out of here. But so the cold part of you would think it'd be like lethargic, they'd be slow. But I mean, I did a Z-Man 3/8 black blue chatterbait in clear water and zinged it past them, and they bit it nonstop. Now, what are they? You made a comment. They're healthy. So are they healthy? Are they chasing? Are they feeding up before the spawn? What are they doing? What's going through their minds here?
It's actually a really good time to catch fish because the water's really cold still. So the fish are in good condition, and it's a good time to be releasing fish that you're catching. The other thing is they've spent the winter really adapting their physiology to that really cold winter water. So what happens when the water starts to warm up even a few degrees in shallower areas, the fish get into those areas, and it has a bigger impact than a few degrees would have, say, almost at any other time of the year. They're just wired for dealing with the cold, and then all of a sudden it's starting to get warm, and it's kind of like start your engines.
Yep.
You know, they start awakening and chasing things, and we caught them on swim baits. I know people that caught them on spinner baits, and on the right time, even big crankbaits reel in slowly. They were eating those too.
From a biological standpoint, is there much going on? You know, after winter, you assume that the weeds are died off; they haven't started growing yet. Is there much going on the bottom that they'd be feeding down, or would you be smart to, you know, run a feed up or mid-water column strategy? What would you know, if you had to pick three? I mean, it sounds like we're going to say it's mid, but, you know, is there much going on that they'd be feeding on the bottom for, or is that probably not the case?
Yeah, I think in the waters out here, you know, and the bays is the same in a lot of ways. There are so many things on the bottom. There are so many gobies, and I think a lot of people realize this, but gobies don't have a swim bladder. They have to be on the bottom. And we've done diet studies. Over 90% of what smallmouth are eating most of the summertime is gobies. And so I have to say that I caught the most fish, and the biggest fish I caught using small swim baits, reeling them relatively slowly close to the bottom. But I know people that caught them up in the water column on other things as well. I think the thing is they haven't seen a bait for a while, so you're in a situation where they're liable to react to a lot of things.
Probably something similar to that.
I'm sure something similar to that would work. Yeah.
Okay, that's the set the hook DSSM, and then I think probably hitting it with the Freedom swim bait head. I know that's an excellent way to catch smallmouth to begin with, but
yep.
No, I didn't know that on gobies. I didn't know that they didn't have a bladder, and that I knew they were primarily on the bottom, but I didn't know the reason that they were there. You know,
yep.
Of course, we're always dragging tubes or doing whatever we can to imitate that, right?
Yep.
But,
the only places you'll see them is on the bottom or in a bass's stomach.
Good to know.
Yeah.
All right. What was next on our list? I'm just going to check it and see. Kind of covered that. So you and I were kind of having a visit earlier, and we were talking about some of the science behind, and this is probably going to open a whole bigger can of worms, but we were talking a little bit about the effects of catching bass on the bed, and then we touched on the effects of killing off or kind of ruining the aggressive males and taking them off their beds and what that does to the overall population. Do you want to take it back? I found that super interesting, but do you want to walk us back through that conversation from earlier and tell everybody kind of what we were getting at there?
Sure. And I think it fits well with what we just talked about in a way, because it really relates to adjusting the closed season so that you are protecting the bass when they're spawning and how important that is. And everybody knows that in North America, there's lots of different management strategies for bass. And in a lot of the southern states and some places in Canada, you can catch bass when they're spawning. And it's been a topic that scientists have sort of debated and talked about for years. It's very challenging to study. But Dave Phillip is a scientist in the U.S. that spent about 30 years of his career studying this, and wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago that pointed out that when you are catching males off a bed, you're likely to catch the most aggressive fish. And there's a paradox that the most aggressive fish that are the genetics that you want to keep in the population. If you're catching fish off beds, you're actually often either taking that fish away to weigh it in a tournament, or you're catching it off a bed when predators like sunfish and other species can get in and ruin that fish's offspring. And so what happens is over time you select away from aggressive genetics and you select towards very docile, what would be really bad dads for parenting in terms of bass raising their young. So I've given talks on this a couple of years ago. I did a few different talks on this and wrote about it because I thought it was just a really interesting topic. But it explains why some of the best anglers we have in Canada can go down, fish south of the border, and in some of these waters, it's really hard to catch a limit. The fish are not very aggressive. When they are active, they're only active for very small periods of the day. And this has actually been explained now in a bunch of different papers in the scientific literature. It can actually happen as selection in recreational fisheries for bass. There's different ways that commercial fisheries select for fish. And it's really evolution caused by angling fish off nests. And, it's one of the reasons why I think if we can, we want to be really careful about protecting those fish that we have spawning when they're spawning so that we don't end up, we're very lucky with the fisheries we have, and we don't want to end up in that kind of a situation.
And on a grand scheme, where that kind of stemmed from is we were talking about, again, my home body of water, the Bay of Quinte, and we're talking about how it seems to be that the fishing is getting tougher and tougher and tougher. And it was great. You kind of explained it. If there's 100 fish, 50 of them are going to come out with an aggressive predisposition, and 50 of them are going to be docile. So you go out and you catch the first, you catch the 50 aggressive fish, but then they start to learn, and we're going to touch that next. This is the segue, but people think that fish don't learn, but they do. So now that those 50 aggressive fish, that just 25 of them are now educated. They're not going to bite again, but the other 25 are so aggressive they're going to bite again. But then we're going to half it, and then we keep calling out and educating all those aggressive fish, and then all of a sudden it becomes really difficult. So by the end of the summer, you're throwing your hands up and you're going, we can't run another tournament on the Bay of Quinte. They just don't bite. We've caught them all. And it's like, well, okay, maybe you caught them all, but they can still be caught. They're still there. So not expand on that a little bit more, but I know that was your playbook there, but sure, that's the right idea. Can we convince everybody that the Bay of Quinte and all these fisheries are still healthy? Just you're going to have to become a better angler to catch them.
Well, that's the thing. And that's why I think that some of these things have been relatively hard to figure out. It's taken scientists a long time to explain a lot of these things. It's not all explained yet. I'll tell you that. That's always going to be the case. But there's multiple things going on. I think that one of the factors that we just talked about was fishing fish off beds. So fishing males off beds will slowly over time make the fish less aggressive in that water body, because the less aggressive fish are the ones that are going to be more successful spawning. The other thing that we talked about earlier was just, I think a lot of people underestimate how quickly fish learn. And I think in water bodies where there's a lot of fishing pressure, especially a lot of tournament pressure, the fish have seen and been caught. They've seen a lot of the lures. They've been caught multiple times, and they become educated. And so the fish are there. And if you look at the fishery in an assessment way that you're not actually looking at how many fish are being caught, the fish are there. But the fish are much more difficult to catch. And so I think one of the things you see that you commonly see, and I compared a lot of this over time, and none of this is the rule everywhere, but in general, you look at the weights at our tournaments in Canada, and we have a lot of big weights for a lot of the field on places like the Bay of Quinte and Lake Ontario. In a lot of the lakes in the U.S., there might be a few people that figure it out and have big weights and an event, but then you have a lot of people that have a lot of trouble even getting a limit. And that was watching some of these Canadian anglers go down and experience that was kind of the I guess the thing I needed to get me going to try to figure out what was causing all that. And I'm not the first one to figure it out, but I think a lot of that is the explanation that a lot of people hadn't heard.
So have we seen any research when you go pre-fishing and you cut your barb off or you bend it over, you don't want to sting the fish. At what point are they learning? At what point, like, does it literally take the ow, that hurt to get into their head, or like, hey, that shiny thing that went by, I ate that, it didn't taste good, I don't really need to eat that again. Like, is there any research behind whether that's in, out? Should we be doing it? Should we not?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a few of the things that we've learned over the years that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. You look at a big body of water like the Bay of Quinte or Lake Ontario, and you get the sense that there's just an endless amount of fish out there. And there's not. So one of the things is the number of fish is limited. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of people think that the fish just roam around in these water bodies looking for food, and they cover large distances, when in fact, most of these fish have a home range that's not much different than a back lake. And there are communities and spots, and if you pay close attention, you'll see the same fish by the same rock multiple times, year after year in some cases.
I heard an arbitrary number. I think it was Corey Johnson was saying that it's 300 yards. You find a fish, he's probably going to spawn, bed, live, and do whatever, unless there's a big migration, 300 yards. Is there any juice behind that, or is that just experience speaking? Or
I think that's experience speaking. In reality, it kind of depends on the water body. But I think we did touch on something early on before we got on here that I think a lot of people should think about. And that is that all these animals are playing a game of energy. It's all about net energy expenditure and net energy gain. And so if they can find food and find a wintering area and find a spawning area, it doesn't make sense to travel long distances. That's a waste of energy. So for bass anyway, what we've learned is that if we catch a fish and tag it, if we don't intentionally move that fish, there's a good chance that that fish is going to be recaught. And Corey's number, like 300 yards, is pretty darn close to bang on. There's a good chance it's going to be caught within, I'd say, half a kilometer where it was caught before. Yeah. And we did a lot of tagging studies, and that's what we found with fish that we didn't move.
Got it. The one thing we are seeing a lot of, and Daryl's kind of, I'm going to try and sum up his question here, but there's been a lot of talk of a bunch of smallmouth invading back into the Bay of Quinte. And I mean, we're so used to thinking of lakes and thinking, well, that's a smallmouth lake, that's a largemouth lake. How often do the smallmouth, would they come in, or if you reintroduce them to a lake, or like, what is it feasible, or is it scientifically, are the smallmouth taking over the Bay of Quinte again? Has there been a shift in the ecosystem that's making it better for them, or are we becoming better anglers with things like forward-facing sonar and better lures and top secret bait fuel and all this stuff to catch more fish? What do you think's happening? Have we seen a biological shift, or are we just becoming that much better at finding those roaming fish and targeting them?
I would say the answer is both. Okay. I think that anglers are definitely getting better at finding fish, but one of the most interesting things about the Great Lakes is that they keep changing. So over time, we've had what it was like prior to zebra mussels, and then we've had zebra mussels clearing up the water column. We've had what it was like before gobies, and then we've had after gobies, a lot of top predators shifted towards eating gobies. We don't pay maybe as much attention, but a lot of the vegetation and other aspects that matter to the fish keep changing too. So humans tend to think of things as fixed, and that, the bay is the bay and that's where everything is. In fact, it's always changing, and especially in the Great Lakes, there's so many invasive species. There's so much change going on. The smallmouth thing is particularly interesting because I think what happened was there originally were a lot of smallmouth in the bay, and then the bay changed and became much better habitat for largemouth, and the largemouth kind of took off. And there was a period in there as well where people caught on to the Lake Ontario smallmouth fishing, and for a period of time were going and catching Lake Ontario smallmouth and weighing them in tournaments in Belleville and Trenton and places like that, and they were getting released in the bay. And that's a whole other topic, but we did a lot of work on that and found that most of those fish that were brought from Lake Ontario into the bay were actually staying in the bay. And I think a lot of those fish were recaught in some of those big bags that were winning tournaments for a period of time. From what I understand now, there's now, juvenile smallmouth that are appearing in the bay in places that can't be explained by somebody bringing them in. There's more natural reproduction, and I think, whether it's just that they've been left alone for a while, or new habitats opened up that they can take advantage of. I know there are now smallmouth born in the bay, lots of them, and people are catching them again.
Yeah, it's last year we in a bunch of the Queenie Fishing Series, they were, they've really become, I think, even in the shootouts. I think almost every tournament that we had down, even Andy's, smallmouth were a factor. And I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, they weren't a factor. They were a bonus fish. It was a great catch, but now you better have smallmouth in your strategy. I know we got robbed. We had a beautiful bag in the Classic. And we thought, when you come in day 2 in the Classic and your bag gets bigger, that it's going to be good. But we were robbed by a bunch of guys that came in with a giant bag of smallmouth. So that was, it's certainly become a factor. So I guess that kind of answers Daryl's question a little bit. And then we did have another question from above. It was Dave Lafreniere, and he was asking, what are the magic temperatures? So in the bay and the largemouth, obviously, are they spawning before the smallmouth at a different temperature? Is there a separation there? And then I'm going to throw a twist into, if they're going to spawn at 2 different temperatures, how does the moon phase affect the spawn in its entirety? So what's the difference between largemouth and smallmouth temperatures for starting their spawn, and how does the moon phase impact both of them?
Yep. I'll start at the beginning of that and deal with one thing at a time. When we were doing all the research that we did on the exact spawning times for both species out in the bay and out in the lake and on the river, what was happening was that largemouth were actually going really shallow where the water was warming fastest and finding little small areas that heated up relatively quickly. So the smallmouth were actually finding warm water early and spawning in it, and they were essentially finished at the time that the season was opening. So if you look at the season change carefully, you'll see that the opening day for smallmouth or for largemouth didn't change. Got to be careful how I explain this in terms of species, but the largemouth were finished at the original opening day, so that was left the way it was. Smallmouth were spawning a little bit more offshore in a little bit deeper water, a little more visible as well, and the water didn't warm up quite as quickly. So that meant that it pushed the dates for smallmouth spawning into what was already now an open season, and that was the problem. So it's interesting because it is smallmouth spawning earlier in warmer water, but a lot of it's actually happening at the same time. Like that warm water is available, but smallmouth aren't using it. The largemouth are using it. The smallmouth are using the colder water, and so it's taking them longer to get finished.
Got it. And moon phase, how is it directly impacting? We have this in the deer hunting world. Does the moon phase impact the rut?
Yeah.
Does the moon phase or the timing of the full moon impact either one of those spawns? Maybe the smallies use it, maybe the largest. Do either one of them care? Is that a factor, or is it literally, what do we got?
Yeah. So where that's at, in my understanding, is that it's something that's talked about an awful lot, but for how much it's talked about, there's not as much science. So there's science showing that some fish and their spawning seems to pulse at the right moon phase. For bass, to my knowledge, it's not actually been studied in a research sense. And so I think what you'll find tonight, and what everybody probably knows about me that knows me, is you kind of have to go with what's the published scientific information. And there's a way that observations feed into that. And I have to say that a lot of the work I've done over the years has been driven by people's observations that I've heard about and thought, nobody's actually figured that out. It would be interesting to go do.
Yep.
I know that Dr. Stephen Cook, fellow researcher from Carleton, worked on a project inland on Lake Opinican with moon phase, and I think looked at activity levels in moon phase and bass and really didn't see anything significant. And I think I'm remembering that correctly. To my knowledge, there hasn't been work on spawning in moon phase. There's just been a lot of observations. What's really interesting now, and people that, just take the technology that we're using as an example, technology is getting so good that the Great Lakes have a lot of telemetry projects on them. We do a lot of work with transmitters and fish and following their behavior throughout the year. And I think that the technology that's available now will make it pretty easy to answer some of those questions over time. And that couldn't be done 25 years ago. But I think now it'll be something that gets studied because it's an interesting question. I think it's been observed so much that, you got to think there might be some truth to that. And I think that somebody just needs to go out and collect the data to convince people like me that it's actually a real phenomenon.
You mentioned the tagging and the telegraphing and recording. We were talking a little bit earlier about even, I guess you've had a little bit of a walleye project, or you're helping out with a walleye project on studying the fish movement. And everybody thinks that the Bay of Quinte is such a great walleye fishery, but it's kind of fascinating what you guys have learned. Like, the fish come from the lake, they go to the bay, they're all around. Like, you want to share a little bit of what we know?
Sure.
So, I know it's still ice fishing season, at least here, for another 5 days. So all the walleye guys are going to be interested in what you have to say on that.
Sure.
What does fish do, and how often are we, again, you kind of hit on it earlier. You talked about there being not as many fish as what we think. And that same fish that you're pounding on, in the Bay of Quinte and Balval is the same fish that you caught at Timber Island in the fall, is the same fish that you caught trolling at the mouth of the river. So what have we learned? What's that population look like? And I'm going to throw in another one in that we didn't talk about earlier, but it's almost like there's a new class of fish through the bay that we haven't seen before, that's moving different spots, and that they're just overall smaller. Has there been a regrowth on Lake Ontario of walleye? Are we stocking it again? I thought I read something about that, but that's been a conversation we've had over the whole a couple times this year. So I want to touch on that.
Sure. I can talk about walleye for a little bit. I did tell you that we have several different projects going on. We do a lot of work in collaboration with the Ministry of Natural Resources. A lot of the biology folks at Glenora, we collaborate on projects with them. And we've been involved in a walleye project now for, I think it's 4 or 5 years. And we've got have transmitters, I think, in over 200 walleye. I have a PhD student who's now writing up his PhD, published the first paper from it on walleye from the Bay of Quinte. And some things are what I would say similar to the bass situation is that I don't think a lot of people appreciate that the fish and the fishery are limited. So what we've seen is that fish from the Trent River, for example, that would spawn in the Trent River, it's almost like running the gauntlet after they spawn. They get out of the bay pretty quick, but they have to get out to Lake Ontario. We're talking about the big fish now. Get out to Lake Ontario where they spend a lot of time feeding. They actually get out there pretty quickly after spawning, and some of them go as far across as to the New York side. They feed up for a lot of the summer, and then in the fall they slowly make their way back to the bay. And we've seen that, some of the places that anglers run into these fish, off Kingston is a good example. They're actually the same fish that have run through several different fisheries in a lot of cases. And right now, I think a lot of people might be interested to know that almost all the fish that spawn in the bay are in the bay right now. They spend most of the winter in there. And so we've got good ice this year. All of those fish are in the bay, and all of those fish are getting caught and either harvested or caught and released. And we were talking earlier about the fact that the fishery is limited. And I've always been an advocate that if you can release the biggest fish you catch, that's really important for the fishery. That's not part of the regulations at the moment, but I think as anglers, sometimes we do things that we're not necessarily regulated to do. And I think that we're just learning this. We're just learning what these fish do, and there's lots more interesting information to come. But some of the most interesting information that really my graduate student Connor talked to me about this week was that he's seeing a lot of people posting on the internet about the big fish they're catching in the bay, and him pointing out, you know what, all those spawning fish are in there right now. So we're getting better at catching them. Social media is helping us target them. I think we want to be careful about which ones we harvest and which ones we put back, and recognize the fishery isn't limitless, and those big fish are the most important genetics in the population, regardless of the regulations.
So I kind of pressed you earlier, and we never got to an answer. And I think the answer was there is no magic time number. But if I caught the biggest fish I've ever caught, so instead of pressing you for a time, I was pushing you for, you can have them out for a minute, 2 minutes. But instead of pushing you for that, can you rattle off 3 things that like here are the do's? If you've caught an 18-pound walleye and you just have to have a picture, obviously we want it back in the water as quick as possible. Somebody told me if you stick their head outside, their eyeballs freeze or things like that. Now, what are 3 things that you can say if you just have to have a picture and it's just an incredible fish and you want to respect it? These are the 3 things you're going to do to respect that fish, get its picture taken, and get it back in the water. What are the do's or don'ts in that scenario? That we want people to respect these fish. We want them to enjoy them year over year. But we kind of talked about. I think everybody wants that too, but they just don't know the don'ts. You want to go outside, you want to hold it up in the pit and get your picture taken, but it's minus 40 out, and then it's like, maybe that is bad for them. So can you give us just 3 points? Sure. What should they not do, and what should they do to keep those fish healthy, happy, and release them, well?
Yeah. Well, and some of it is consistent throughout the year, and some of it changes depending on the circumstances. But I think that one thing which I've found interesting over the years and talked a bit about with you guys to begin with, some of those trophy fish are actually the more fragile individuals. It's easier for things to go wrong with them. And people that have caught big bass and weighed them in for years, I think, can attest to this. Some of those bigger fish are the harder ones to keep in good shape throughout the day. So recognizing that, if you're trying to get a picture of a trophy fish, I think it's really important to be prepared for that picture, because just like your line should be, the kind of line that's not going to break when you finally hook into that fish that you've been chasing for years. I think you also want to have it in mind that you may want to get a picture when you go to the bay, so that you've got things ready. You're not keeping the fish out of water for a long period of time. The best thing that we've said to people, I think, over the years is air exposure matters, whether it's summertime or wintertime. A way to think about it as a person is you can hold your breath for a little bit, but if you try doing it after you've just exercised, it's a lot harder to do. When you take those fish out of water, they're not getting oxygen after you've just angled them. And then certain situations like the wintertime can add to the problems. If you've got really cold temperatures, you don't want to keep that fish out bouncing around on the ice for a while. You want to get your picture, get it back in the water. Even holding it and keeping the front half of the fish in the water, if you're trying to get more than one picture or something like that, while you're not taking a picture, get that fish so that a good front end of that fish is back in the water, and then take another picture when you're ready. But minimize air exposure, get them back in the water as quick as you can, and release the biggest ones you catch if you're going to take my advice.
I think generally most people say, if it's less than 8 pounds, without a doubt, you throw it back, and I'm sorry, if it's more than 8 pounds, get rid of it. But most people don't like eating them past 5 or 6 pounds, so if it's a quality meat thing, throw the big one back and catch a little one. You're going to enjoy eating it that much more.
I was going to say, you're not going to be able to tell when it's on the plate, and if anything, the smaller ones taste better.
Yeah, exactly. So, All right. Well, that touches on that one. Um, let's move to how bass senses work, because I'm sure everybody wants to head there, and that'll
Sure.
segue probably into what everybody's really waiting to find out about, which is this new secret bait fuel thing. But um, let's educate them. Let's talk about the pyramid of what sets up for, well, I guess bass or walleye, because we talked about this for ice fishing too. You know, this new bait fuel stuff's going to do the same. But let's talk about setting it up. You know, what they need to make a strike, what all goes into it, and then maybe we segue right into talking about bait fuel. So
Sure. And we could talk about this for a long time, so I'm going to try to give it to you in pieces. But um, first thing to recognize is there's fish that are actively feeding, and most of the predators that we catch are visual predators. So if you get into fish that are actively feeding, you can catch them with a moving bait, and all they need to see is the right shape and see it moving, and there's a good chance they're going to strike it. Where it gets interesting and complicated is that most of the time we're actually fishing for fish that aren't maybe feeding as actively as that. We're fishing for less aggressive fish, sometimes really, almost quiescent fish. And the trick then becomes not only attracting them to your bait, but other senses come into play. So they're visual predators overall. And interestingly, if you look at the brains of the predators that we fish, the visual lobes are actually the biggest part of the brain, and that's one of the ways that scientists have determined that how important vision is for these species. But then, as the fish approaches your bait, I think now we're all experiencing fisheries where you'll have fish that'll come right up to your bait. This is something that happens in ice fishing a lot. You have fish come in, you have fish that you can see on your electronics. Their nose is right up to your bait, but nothing's happening. And what's happening there is the fish has used vision, maybe even started with sound to realize there's something in the area, used its eyes to see where the bait is, go over and sit beside it. And then you're talking about, if the fish isn't that interested, you've got to try to fool the other senses. And this is where things like smell and taste become important. It's those fish that are a little less aggressive, more finicky, we'd call them as anglers. And you've got to convince them in that last foot or so to commit and actually eat the bait. And that's where a lot of the senses, that's where taste, smell become really important. And I think a lot of people could probably relate to this, even if you were fishing bluegills off a dock with your child. You can see the fish come out. Sometimes they'll suck in the bait and spit it out a bunch of times, often before anybody can set the hook. Bass do the same thing. You don't get to see it as often, but I know most bass anglers have seen bass come and they'll take something into their mouth so quickly and spit it out that you just don't even have time to set the hook. And what they're doing is tasting it. So they're tasting it. It's touching the receptors that are looking for something that is, I think the way I've written about it before, it's like a lock and a key. So they're looking for a certain key to unlock the receptor and tell it that it's food. And at close range and with finicky fish, that's what you've got to try to fool to push them over the edge. So I think that's probably, that's where there's a whole market for scents and things that taste a certain way, smell a certain way. There's an awful lot of marketing behind an awful lot of different products with different theories behind them. But I think it's fair to say that there's not a lot of science. There's some science, but there's not a lot of science.
So you sent me some pre-read here, and I was going through the one, and we were, I was picking on the colors. Does color matter? Does color matter? And then we kind of started talking about the different factors and things. So let's touch on maybe colors versus patterns. Like, one thing that I thought of after our conversation was, obviously, fire tiger, purple or Bengal tiger, some of those things that I think of when I think of walleye. When you think about it, they all have the stripes on their back, just the same as a perch. So it's like, is it the purple or the pink or the green or the orange? We know green and orange for walleye, but is it color versus, hey, I recognize those stripes on the back? There's a visual cue. I'm going to eat that.
Right.
Or bigger eyes. We talked about,
Sure.
Maybe let's break that apart and talk about colors versus patterns or triggers or factors.
Absolutely. That's a really good point to bring up at this time, because we talked about vision. And I think when we talk about vision, a lot of people think of color or flash, and they kind of leave it there. But really, visual cues can be how the bait moves. It can be patterns on the bait. It can be the size of the bait. It can be the shape of the bait. The way a jerk bait comes through the water. All those kinds of things are cues for vision. But then the other thing that was in that article that I sent to you was the fact that we tend to look at, say, a prey fish and look at it as a whole prey fish and think that every part has equal importance to a predator that's going to eat that prey fish. And so you get some lures that are just exact replicas of prey fish. What science has learned in fish and other animals is that the way that most of these things work is it's not the whole pattern. It's not the whole package that matters. It's certain parts have more importance than others. And sometimes it can just be one thing, like we talked about an eyeball or a certain shape or a certain movement. I mean, people that are good with a jerk bait know how important the movement is, and it almost doesn't matter in some cases what the color of the bait is if you get the movement right.
Yeah.
And so you've got to think that the way a fish's brain actually works is it's looking for certain cues, and the way I've talked about those are like a lock and key, and that instead of a bait being a whole package, it's actually a whole bunch of potential cues, and you've got to figure out which ones matter.
Yeah.
And that's where you find that there are, what the article I sent you, I think it was called "Why Do Bass Eat a Spinnerbait?" If you look at a spinnerbait, what does it really look like? So we know it looks something like a bait fish when it's moving through the water, but you could do a lot better job of making something look like a bait fish. But spinnerbaits obviously have cues in them that trigger fish. I think there's no debating that. And so that's what we're talking about. And we can talk about it with vision, and different species under different conditions have different things they're looking for as cues. And if you hit on the right cue, you catch a lot of fish.
Yep.
And then with other things like scent and taste, same kind of thing. It's just different cues for different senses.
So like one of these cues here?
Like one of those cues.
All right, let's talk about it, because I see a couple of the people that are hanging out here, and I know they just want to pick our brain about BaitFuel. I know a bunch of us got to pre-use it down here by knowing a couple of right people last summer, towards the end of the summer. It worked well. I know that there's been a couple posts from, I think, Brian Thrift and some other Bass Master Elite guys that actually demonstrated how well it's using. So I guess you were involved. This is part of your brainchild here. So let's talk about BaitFuel. Let's talk about why everybody's so excited for it. Let's talk about why it's going to be so successful, why people are already seeing that it's super successful, and then just some of the things that we need to know about it. So what was your involvement in it? How did this come to fruition?
Sure. Well, I think depending on how long people have known me, I actually started out my career mostly working in an area called fish physiology, which is how fish work, which is all the kinds of things that we've just talked about, all the pieces, just like a car engine and a good mechanic knowing how all the parts work together to make it work. Physiologists work on animals, and in my case, it's fish, and try to understand how all the parts go together and do the different things the animal has to do. And if you're interested in things like that, there's parts that you research, and there's parts that you just have some expertise and maybe teach in, things like that. So I have that background, and then, for interest's sake, I guess, in a way, and to educate people, know that I've given talks to lots of angling clubs about some of these topics. I've written about them many times in different articles about how different senses work. And so with that kind of expertise, American Baitworks approached me to consider working together. And recognizing that there are a lot of products that don't have a scientific basis, came up with the idea that maybe if we work together, we could use science to develop some products that would help anglers catch more fish. And so, that was kind of the germ that started BaitFuel. And what BaitFuel is a whole bunch of science that started with a massive search of the literature to look at everything from far afield in areas like medicine, where fish are used as some models with simple brains to work on, to other, aquaculture and all kinds of things that have researched how fish feed and what makes them eat certain things, and how their brains work and how all that plays into it. And so we came up with some ideas for a product that would have certain compounds in it that would serve as those keys to unlock receptors for smell and taste in species like bass. And then we basically went to the lab, and I say we, but honestly, there's a couple people that spent almost 2 years in the lab running experiments to test our ideas and to see what the fish told us about what they actually like in reality. And so we went through different formulations. We went through different amounts of things. And after a couple of years and many, I could say probably thousands of experiments and analyzing video, came up with something that really, I think, just kind of hits it out of the park for bass and a lot of the other top predators. And that is BaitFuel.
So there was some stuff that we were surprised about. You were surprised about. I was surprised about. One, I think, was garlic. Was it garlic that didn't yield positive results for?
That's one of the things. One of the things we talked about. Yeah, we were kind of. I have to be a little bit careful here what I say to people, because I know garlic is one of those things that's been out there in the fishing world for many years, and there's other things. Coffee is another one. Things like that.
Yeah.
You have to. I mean, you start by thinking about it and thinking how often a fish would actually encounter that and why it would stimulate its receptors to feed. And so, that kind of lays the foundation for actually doing the experiment. What I told you about was, I think, because there are so many people that think that some of these things have an impact, we, in the development of BaitFuel, did a bit of work testing things like garlic and a few other things, just to show how well our experiments were working and to show that something like that actually didn't change how the fish reacted to the bait whatsoever.
Yep.
So we're not the first ones to show that, and people that have done science in this area have pointed that out as well. And in our experiments, there was no effect of something like garlic.
Yep.
When we took compounds that were actually in the prey that these predators feed on, it's actually, not surprisingly, some of the key compounds in those prey fish and other things like crayfish and things that fish actually eat that are the keys that unlock the receptors that get the fish to feed on them.
Yep. Well, one of the things that shocked me about it when I first got to play with it, it's like there's no smell to this. You take it out and you're like, okay, if it's not garlic and it's not coffee, what's it? It smells like nothing, and it's like, it smells like nothing. So, like, as an angler, you're all excited to smell it. I mean, you smell stuff, it's like, whoa, that's gross. It's gonna work. You smell this, and it's like, but it doesn't smell, but it works. So, what's the juice here? What's
that? Yeah, what's the magic? So that's funny. It's funny again. You say that because you're bringing up things that we went through as we developed this and talked with people about it. And fish smell things that are soluble in water. They taste things that are soluble in water. When things are dissolved in water, that's when they smell them and taste them. And so when you open up the bait package, you don't smell anything because our system for smell works in air. So we can't smell what the fish are going to smell when they smell that bait. But when you put the bait in the water and what's in the bait starts to diffuse into the water, or the fish bites it and it diffuses into the fish's mouth, that's when it works. So the logic actually makes sense. It doesn't reek or stink, and I think a lot of people might be happy. Their boat carpets are going to be happy.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that, and we went back and forth. Wow, it's kind of a funny thing that this thing that is such a great stimulant for smell and taste doesn't have any smell to humans at all. But in fact, it doesn't need to.
No, and like you take it and you put it, like I got a drifter here, and I know like that when it comes to set the hook, I mean, you take one of the very best baits that you can possibly make for all the visual cues, and then you impregnate it in it, or you can put it on, or there's two ways. Run us through that. Like,
sure,
you got a really good, amazing set the hook bait drifter, drop it, but I can have it on the external, I can have it on the internal, like.
Yeah, so these two things are coming out here. Some are already making it onto the shelves. You've got some baits there from Set the Hook that have BaitFuel in them.
Yep.
So one of the ways that we've made BaitFuel available is to put it in Set the Hook plastisol baits and to put it into net bait plastisol baits soon. And it will be in those baits when you buy the bait, and there's really nothing you need to do other than fish with the bait the way you would normally fish with the bait. Yep. When the fish gets close to the bait or tastes the bait, that's when the BaitFuel will work, and it's in the bait. But then everybody's got their favorite bait that might not be from those companies. Like we've all used different baits over the years and got the old standby things that we rely on. And it's just reality that, they're not all going to be Set the Hook products or net bait products. And so for those situations, we've come up with a formulation where BaitFuel is available in a gel form. And what you'll be able to do is take your plastisol baits that might be baits that you like to use from another company, and you can put BaitFuel into the bag. Best way I would recommend is put it in the bag, let it soak overnight, or put it in the bag in the morning when you get in your boat. Let the BaitFuel soak into those baits, and then fish with those baits, and they will have BaitFuel in them from the gel. And some of that gel will stick on the bait, and for a period of time, you'll be fishing with BaitFuel with a different plastisol bait. And then, recharge them when you want to.
Yeah, because we talked about that. I know I've used Maxen for quite a while, and in my opinion, and I don't know if I can get in trouble with this or not, but I mean, if you got two brands, you've got, of course, Berkley Maxen, which is crushing it with the flatworm. Everybody's after it. But now you've got BaitFuel, which is scientifically engineered here. I mean, you've got two leading companies with leading scientists putting all of this energy into it and creating something that's going to put, I'm going to use the word, a plume around your bait to trick the fish's senses. Like, these are the stories that we're seeing the difference all the time. It's fantastic. And a lot of people are kind of wondering what's the comparison, but you have two. I think we're on a level playing field. It's almost you're never going to be able to say that one's better than the other, but what are the similarities? I'm gonna paint you in the corner. I'm gonna make you draw a direct connection. But what are the similarities between a very successful Maxent and this new bait that's rolling out that everybody's talking about that is clearly very successul too? What's similar? And I don't know if we know the differences, but if you can maybe shed some light on that.
Sure. If I can stick out my way out of this. So I think to start off with, I wanted to try to take that and say that there's a very small number of baits out on the market with scents that have been developed through extensive laboratory experiments. And so, as you pointed out right away, you narrow that down, narrow the field down greatly by doing that. One of the things that you get with the Set the Hook and net bait products is you've got baits that are proven good action plastisol baits that have already got a great reputation for catching fish based on their action and that's well established. So a lot of people already use those baits and catch lots of fish. So in this case, we figured out a way to take advantage of the fact that they've got this really well established action and infuse bait fuel into those baits so that they now not only have the action, but they've got the smell and the taste the fish are looking for. So the fish are attracted to the bait because of the action. They get close to the bait, and now they've got the smell and the taste they're looking for to unlock that last step and get the fish to commit. Be careful about how I say this, but not all the other baits with scents that maybe develop the same way have the same kind of texture and proven action and stay on the hook as well as the ones that I think NetBait and Set the Hook are producing. And so, I think it's fair to say most anglers want to have a bit of choice and a bit of a mixed bag. And certainly Max Scent has won over a lot of people. But if you think about what we're talking about now, we're talking about baits that had already won over a lot of people with their action and their shapes and how they behave in the water. And now we're adding this extra punch to them by putting bait fuel into them. So, it's something that's also going to be awfully effective. And I can tell you there's already been tournaments won with them, even though, it's sort of on the prototype phase when some of these tournaments have been won. But, people are already winning money with those. There's pros that are fishing with them and swearing by them, people that are in situations where they can't catch a fish, they put bait fuel on or they put a bait fuel bait on and they get that fish to commit. So,
and everybody's been talking about that. I certainly experienced that a whole ton in the last half of the season last year. So I've been all winter long just, when's it coming, guys? When's it coming? When do we get it? But then to see, I think it was Brian Thrift do it on video for everybody to see in real time. Can't catch fish, can't catch. Boom, bait fuel goes. Boom, he starts catching fish. It's like, okay, well, there's your visual proof right there.
Right.
I mean, and as soon as somebody tries it, they're gonna fall into the trap. They're gonna see for themselves and have that aha moment. I know they've been pouring, like we in store, we have the drifter minnow, the DSSM ready to go. And then I think we ordered a few hundred bottles. They have released the gel now. I know it's going into production and it should be along in the next month or two. When we get the exact date here, we'll put a big e-blast out and we'll send it out for everybody to have. I know everybody wants the bottles of it. I know everybody wants to buy this product, but if you sign up for the email notifications on Tackle Depot, when we get it, we're going to push it out, let everybody know we have it. We just don't want to take pre-orders and cause a mess of it right now until we know it's in our hands, and then we can, ship it out fast. That's pretty much what Tackle Depot is all about, is trying to deliver it as fast as we can to Canadians at a perfect price. And anyways, that was my own plug for ourselves here, but it is coming. It is available. But let's keep going back to a little bit of the science behind it. And the plume. The plume is always what got me. Like, you throw it out and you let it soak, and then we're actually, you watch the Max Scent commercial and the cloud goes around it and starts to drift around and draw the fish in. We're talking the same thing here, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's an animation to show people what diffusion out of a bait looks like.
Yep.
The same kind of diffusion is happening out of bait fuel products. In reality, there's a gradient. So the closer you are to the bait, the more dense that cloud is going to be.
Yep.
And we're talking about trying to commit fish that are in a relatively close range. They've looked at something that they're interested in and they've approached it and they're close by, and then in the examples that we've talked about, it's that getting that last commitment from the fish. And that's where, that bit of diffusion, and a lot of anglers, I'm sure, listening to this, have had fish look like they've gone up and pretty much touched their nose onto their bait, but they just haven't inhaled it, or they've tasted it so quickly you can't set the hook. So what this product, I think, will help with is that the fish will want to take it in its mouth. it will want to hold on to it. In the lab, if they don't swallow it immediately, they actually will keep trying it and giving you multiple opportunities when you're in the field angling to have that time to set the hook. So
Yeah.
I know the field testaments are amazing, but I have to say, as a scientist, to be able to put fish in tanks and randomly design experiments so some fish get something and some fish don't, but everything else is actually highly controlled and the same, it actually means more to me to see data produced like that that's so significantly different it blows you away. Then, we've all seen how pros can give testaments to certain things that you kind of wonder, well, is there anything else to it? And what's neat about this is there is just a ton of science from the lab where everything's controlled, and we've tested those products and created them that way.
So one thing that we kind of skipped over and talked about, but I mean, it's obviously notable on the drifter, is the eyes on it. And then if you haven't fished with one, they have a very obvious eye to it. And we were talking about some of those factors that the predator fish cue in on, and we were talking a little bit about oversized eyes, or you think of some of the Japanese baits, and they have some very specific eye looks to them. So let's go back to some of the features that they'd cue in on, and like, how important is eyes on your bait? You think it's the be all end all? You should have them.
Yep.
I know Cotton Cordell always used to put the big round spot on the sides, give something for the fish to target at. So
Yep.
what are some of those visual cues that when you're shopping for a bait, you're like, yeah, you know what? I just feel better when they have eyes on them. I feel better if it had. What are some of the things you,
right,
applying your scientific background and your angling background, keying on when you're trying to buy a bait?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things I think as we go into this conversation that's important to talk about is that we've discussed the fact that there are certain cues that the fish are looking for, and you can use science over time to test whether those things matter. And I have to say, coming at it from the science point of view, over time as we go forward, there'll be some interesting things that we have yet to test that might be cues that fish are targeting when they're deciding whether to eat a bait. I think eyes are a great candidate. Other things that sometimes have been talked about, things like flash, what's the role of sound, all these different things. Myself, I think what I've realized is to stop going towards necessarily what just looks good to me as a replica of a prey fish, and to start pulling it apart and realizing if the fish is, if most of the fish that I'm catching are eating something of a certain size, then right out of the gate, you want to think about probably trying to get in that size range. And that's, I think, something that's been really effective about the drifter. And I'm not sure I've had the one-on-one conversation with Peter about that, but it was around the time that the drifter came out that we were also looking at stomachs from smallmouth from the Great Lakes and looking at all the gobies that were in there and what the size range and average size of those gobies were. And there's lots of big gobies out there. Everybody's probably seen fish spitting up giant gobies, but the average size of those gobies is actually surprisingly close to what a drifter is. And I think that's one of the reasons the size and the shape of a drifter combined with the eyes make it a really effective bait. Yep.
So keying in on the size is super important.
That's what I look for. I think other people have, depends what you're trying to do, but certainly if you want to catch a lot of fish, I think cueing in on what they're eating and matching the size of that is a good starting place.
So I just invented this one up on the fly. Live Target, they always sold a little goby, and it looked just like a goby. And I dragged that little goby around, and I can't catch fish on it for the life of me. It's like it's the same size as a goby. It looks like a goby, but clearly it's missing something. I can watch it. I can drag, flip it out. take a generic tube that looks nothing like a goby, but it's the same shape and color, drag it past that fish, he's on it. It's like,
Yep.
how does this work? And you kind of hit it on, you're like, well, stop buying replicas and start thinking about the science behind it. But it's, in my mind, I just can't comprehend. If it looks like a goby and it's shaped like a goby and it swims like a goby, why don't they eat it?
Right. And I think that's what you have to think about, is opening up your mind to the fact that it's not all about how good it looks to us as a replica of what you think the fish are eating. But I'm sure if we could go to the lab now and spend enough time playing with those two products that you just talked about and removing parts of them and comparing how they did different things, we would find a lot of differences. And there's what's fun about doing the science is there's answers that become consistent. Yep. And when you hit on those consistent answers, it just gets really fun and exciting. And I'm sure that in these baits, whether it was intentional or it just happened when they were made, tubes have been around and been effective for so long. And there's obviously some things about a tube that fish just love. And, I would over time love to try to identify exactly what those things are. And, I think the fun thing will be in the future trying to find some things that maybe people haven't already exploited. So it's fun to figure out the why of things that are already out there, but it's going to be a lot of fun, I think, as we go forward to develop some things that maybe people haven't already thought about that may actually be cues that fish are zeroing in on and can make a difference in a bait.
So we talked a bit about BaitFuel, and we talked about the ability to apply it yourself. And we talked about your research showed that you can actually have too much BaitFuel, not enough. And then I kind of brought up the question, well, if it's the secret sauce, why don't I just lather it in there and put it to it? So do you want to kind of recap, go through that conversation, just kind of share with everybody that how you've safeguarded against that, or how it's been developed to safeguard against the over application of it, and sure. And all that good stuff.
Sure. So let's take a baking in your kitchen example. You've got the ingredients you need to make something like a cake or whatever. If you follow the recipe, you're following certain amounts to get the desired effect, right? If you mix up the amounts, you're not going to get what you wanted. It's almost the same thing. So we identified compounds that we thought would be important. And then what I was talking about, to clarify for everybody, was the fact that even though you might have the right compound, if you don't do the experiments, you can add too much of it or too little of it, and more is not always better. A lot of responses in animals kind of look like this. So even if you're talking about the size of a bait, you hit on a sweet spot, which is where it works best, and it's not necessarily the biggest, or it's not necessarily the most amount of the compound in the bait. So we created a recipe for BaitFuel that we optimized the amounts. So in the soft plastics, that's already optimized to get the effect you're looking for. And all you have to do with other plastisol baits is put the gel on them or let the gel soak into them, and the compounds are at the right concentration in the gel. So you don't have to have the whole bottle on your baits. It's not going to make them any better. You just want them to, you've seen products where there's a liquid in the package. You just want to have enough liquid in the package that your baits are getting exposed to it and soaking in it, or putting it on so it's enough to be on your bait. And the bait itself, the BaitFuel is going to do the rest because it's already at the right concentration that will work best.
Yeah, and I had some time to wrestle around with that, and I got thinking, at first it was like, we were thinking and talking through the question, how long is that bait good for before it's totally diffused or leaked out all the goodness in it? And at first I was like, man, I want that to last all day for me or whatever. But then I got to think about it. I mean, if I throw a bait out and it's leaching the secret sauce out for the fish and it stops leaching, that means that it actually did something. There was a set amount and it's dispersed. It's done its job. You throw it away and you put on a new one. And I'm okay with that. But we were kind of talking about it like, the effectiveness of that, would you say, I know the answer was if we think there's a good opportunity to catch a fish, we're going to refresh it. But what did we say? Time was like kind of fish for a couple hours or the morning on it before you think it's diffused, or what's the guidelines here? So when I've made my purchase, I'm excited. I'm going to go throw it out there. At what point in time? Because I don't want to have that on all morning, and then when I actually come across the fish, it's diffused. It's done its job perfectly.
Right.
But then it's like, well, there's the fish, and this, the bait fuel doesn't work. No, the bait fuel worked. It just diffused itself. So people need to be mindful that, this isn't a magnetic shield on this bait that works all the time with no love here. Like, what's the rough guideline that we can tell people so when they get this product and they hit the market and they go fishing and they're like, man, I fished for that with 6 hours and I saw a fish on the 6th hour and I couldn't catch them. You probably had no bait fuel left, right? So
we can talk about that. It's actually good you brought that up. So if you think about the plastisol baits, we'll talk about those first. They're actually porous on a microscopic level. So what that means is that, for example, we talked about this as a good example. If you take something like a Senko and you put it in a cup of water and you leave it there for a week, you're going to come back and it's going to be 3 or 4 times as big as it was when you put it in. The plastisol is porous and it's going to take up some of that water. So there's a certain porosity to those baits, even though they're plastisol. And part of that is going to allow the bait fuel to diffuse out of the bait into the water, just the layer right around the bait. But there's also going to be bait fuel in the pockets in the bait. And really that won't get released unless it's bitten into by a fish.
Yep.
And so, there's a few ways to look at using up a bait here. And there will be bait fuel in the bait that if a fish bites it, even though you might have used it for a couple hours, if that's one of your first bites on it, that fish is going to get a pop of bait fuel. So it's still there. We talk about, and I think a lot of us do this, we talk about fun fishing or whether you're tournament fishing and trying to catch that fish of a lifetime, whatever. It certainly wouldn't hurt to be refreshing the baits, when you think you're going to come across that fish or you're trying to catch that fish that you're really trying to get as your last fish in a tournament or the fish you want to catch that day. So there is an advantage over time to using a new bait now and then. If those baits haven't been chewed up and they're the plastisol baits, you can actually put some of the gel back in the package and you can sort of refresh those baits and use them again. So that's another way to use the two products together.
So that was an important point out that we never caught before is, you're going to be able to buy the set the hook and the net bait stuff infused, and then you're going to be able to gel up other soft plastics. But ideally, you want the 1-2 combo of you want to set the hook or a net bait because it will be infused. So when that fish does bite down, you're going to give them that extra shot, even if the gel's, So the best case scenario is set the hook and bait fuel. A great alternative is just putting bait fuel on another plastic, one of your favorites. Or, I was thinking, can I put this on my trailer for my chatterbait or my spin bait? When I put a chunk on there, something so that when he bites down, I get that extra second to set it and let him have. Certainly, I guess when you're flipping too, that having him hold that in his mouth for that extra second while you take up the slack and let him rip. All your jig fishing, like it's when you think about extra seconds, I guess you could really make a case for this bait fuel stuff that's going to save the day, right?
For a lot of us, we need those extra seconds. There are certainly some guys out there that don't need a lot of time. I'll take as much time as I can get.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. I did see a few questions pop by. Let's do a couple of those. Dare Holloway again was saying, do fish tend to go deeper with a heavier barometric pressure system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that kind of a question, again, is not something that I'm aware of has published science on it in the literature. But I think what you're going to see with all the technology that's out there now that scientists are using, where they can, like, we are getting millions of data points of what fish are doing every few seconds of 365 days of the year. So now you'll be able to take a lot of that information over time and look at the importance of things like changing barometric pressure and see if there's actually a relationship between what depth the fish is at, what the fish's activity is like, and some of those things we've always talked about, like high pressure systems or low pressure systems, or, is it pushing the fish deeper, making them more active? I guess I'm in a position where I predict. I don't think there's, to my knowledge, any science on that in the species we're talking about tonight. Yet I would predict that you're going to see that in the next 5 years. So we're going to have answers to those kinds of things.
Got it. Next question was Trevor Sweet. He says, has adding the bait fuel to the baits made them softer, or do they still stand up for the same durability wise? Or is there, let's broaden that, is there any impact that changes the plastisol compositions? Or I'm sure you guys kind of work that out in the lab ahead of time, but if I put bait fuel on my bait that you haven't tested in the lab, am I going to have a negative impact there? Or could you say that the compounds are pretty much safe to go through any plastisol?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with the soft plastics. And I'm going to say that I think great care has been put into producing the soft plastics with bait fuel so that you really can't tell that there's any difference that it has bait fuel in it. So it's going to have the exact same feel and action and strength as the baits that you were used to before they had bait fuel in them. Another thing about the gel is that you're going to put it in your bag with either, bait fuel baits you want to regenerate, or you might put it in with other products that you want to get bait fuel into. There's a certain, for lack of a better word, gel feel to, the bait fuel gel. Feels a bit like, I don't know if people have had ultrasounds and things like that, but there's kind of a gel aspect to the bait fuel gel. What's nice about it is it's not an oil-based product. It's actually a water-based product so that it works properly in the water where the fish's receptors work. What makes that kind of nice for anglers is you can get it on your hands, get it on your carpet, whatever, and you just rinse it off and it's gone. Like it just dissolves and it's gone. So
that's an added bonus. And another question that rolled in, I think, is the same answer: is how does bait fuel work on Z-Man plastic? Of course, Z-Man plastic is that elastic, that stretchy stuff. But I think we're probably going with the same answer. No big deal.
Yeah, I everybody that knows Z-Man products know there's a bit of a wild card there. It's not, Z-Man products aren't the same plastisol that is in most other baits that we're used to as soft plastics. It's a different material. That's why you can't mix it with plastisol baits. They don't play well together in the sandbox. So I would guess that bait fuel gel in the short term would work fine on Z-Man baits, but somebody's going to have to try that and let us know.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it'd be hard to sit down and test every bait and give a concrete answer. So the safest answer is good luck. Try it. You'll find out. Okay. My question, of all of the research, of all the things you've got to do in your career, and it's been an absolutely fantastic one, what was the one that you thought, you put a hypothesis out there and you said, this is going to be the answer? And by the end of it, you were like, wow, I was wrong and I didn't see that coming. What was that like? I'm glad I tested that because I was dead wrong. What was that moment? What was that thing that you were like, yeah.
Right. That's a good one. I think that as scientists, you get used to being wrong more than you get used to being right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to twist that a little bit and say that probably one of the most enjoyable things that I feel has been a big part of my scientific career has been figuring out what animals do and often getting surprised that it's not what I thought. but it kind of makes sense. And here's a good one, and I think it's good for the audience tonight. So we have spent the last few years looking at bass populations in the Great Lakes. And when I first started that work, I felt like everything's bigger in the Great Lakes. The fish are going to move bigger distances. The fish are going to, have bigger home ranges, and we may put transmitters in fish and never see them again, or tag fish, never see them again. In fact, what was most interesting to me was that we found out that we're actually totally wrong with that. The Great Lakes for bass, anyway, turns out that it's mostly communities of fish that live in relatively small home ranges that are very much, like you said, Corey Johnson described, a certain amount of area where they can find everything they need. And so my thought that everything would be larger was actually wrong. And to realize that really, if they're playing a game of energy, then it actually makes sense that energy becomes the dominating factor, and everything's got to be very energy efficient. So if there's lots of food, why have a big home range? So even though we have this massive lake out there, you need to think of it as the fish aren't the same and all over the place and moving everywhere. There's actually places where they live, and the fish that live in one community over here are different individuals than live in that community over there that might be just 10 kilometers on another part of the shoreline or another island.
So everybody knows about the ducks. Are the fish that live at the ducks going to stay, despite us catching them and taking them for a little boat ride every once in a while?
Yep.
365 days a year. Are you saying that for the most part, that community of fish, they might be a little off the island, they might be right up on it. Those fish are staying there. They're not going to pack her up and head to Clayton or head to Kingston, head into the bay. They're going to live there for the most part. It might be harder to find, but they're going to be there somewhere.
Yeah, unless somebody takes them somewhere. I can tell you that in most of those places, and the ducks are a good example, those are Maine ducks bass. They live there. They stay there and do everything that they have to do within a relatively close proximity to that area.
Yep.
I think what's maybe fun for anglers to think about that are listening to this is that, you're out there pre-fishing or just fishing and seeing what you see, and you might see fish that previously you might have thought, oh, well, they may swim off and I'll never see them again.
Yep.
If you locate good fish in an area, even if you're talking about an area as big as the Great Lakes, there's a good chance that if you try to find that fish again, unless it's been moved by an angler, it's going to be relatively close by. It may be a little deeper, it may be a little shallower or east or west, but it's not gone that you'll never see it again. And tournament anglers that I've talked to about this, I think, have realized, and some of them even have changed their pre-fishing strategies from trying to catch a bunch of fish and say, oh yeah, pre-fish was great, caught all kinds of fish. I went back on tournament day, it just wasn't the same. Well, you're probably trying to catch the same fish, or a lot of them, and you've already stung those fish. So, or someone else has. So it's good to keep in mind that, if you've spotted individuals that you're trying to catch, they're not going to be far away, unless they've been moved.
So is there an average, and I know you're going to tell me this changes on every body of water, is there an average school size? Is there if I roll into a weed patch and I catch 2, do I get to go, well, if I caught 2, there's 25. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Is it I know there can be lone fish, but is there any scientific study that says this is the average school of fish? Or let's talk, in my world, I'm obviously a big hunter too. M&R comes out and says, okay, in your area, there's 5 deer per square kilometer.
Right.
Okay, what are we looking at when we talk about bass densities? Let's just say Canadian waters. Is there any numbers you can share where you can be like, you know what, Ben? Yeah, if you're in a spot you caught 3, there's probably another 20 that you didn't know about. If you're in a spot that caught 1, then maybe there's 5. Is there anything that you can throw at us that it's all right, I found the community. How many are in my community?
Yep. And I'm sure that people who spend a lot of time out there have seen this too. I've seen, and especially my my graduate students that are out there day after day have seen hundreds of fish in some schools at certain times of the year doing certain things. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's very hard from the school size aspect. It's very hard to predict what an average school size is, and in a lot of cases, you're actually just looking at scattered individuals. So there's some fish that hang out together, and there's some fish that hang out by themselves. We often fish fisheries where they've been picked over as well, and individuals have been removed. So there's no easy answer to that, but kind of related to that is that if you find a lot of good fish in an area, the theory behind the ecology is that that's holding those fish for a reason. They're there for a reason, and they're going to be back there at times, if not a lot of the time, because it might be the prime combination of feeding and shelter. The best place for them to get, remember I talked about energy, the best place for them to get the most food when expending the least amount of energy. So those are the kinds of places where you hit on, what some of us call the mother lode or whatever, and we have a great day. Well, it's because those fish are there for a reason. And most of the season, that's what they're eating, and a combination of I guess, habitat that holds that prey, and also that is really well suited to allowing those predators to feed there comfortably.
So in your research, talking about where they're going, what they're doing, I've done lots of reading. I've read all kinds of stuff, and it's always that 25% of the fish are going to slide up and go shallow when we're talking bass. 75% are going to drop deep, and it's like, okay, well, what does deep mean? What does this mean? Are you in for the 25-75 split? Do you think it's maybe a little different? We're just focusing on a broad Canadian stroke. I know everything, is obviously way different down south, but are you buying that? Are you buying, it's 25-75? And when we say they move deep, are we talking 10 feet plus? Are we talking, I know, again, with these broad statements that nobody's going to hold you to, but it's like, I spend a lot of time idling in some real deep water looking for this mother lode or largemouth, and I haven't found it yet. So, not that it doesn't happen, but help me have a better tournament season.
Sure.
What can you shed on that?
Yeah, I can tell you that I think most of the fish we're chasing these days are feeding in relatively shallow water, and then they're probably metabolizing and resting in deeper water. So that often happens, although for a largemouth that can be the bottom of a thick weed bed that might only be 8 feet deep, but probably easier to explain with smallmouth. And the things that we see is that they move a lot in a depth sense, and they're often moving up shallower to feed, and then that will be the time where some of those afternoons where you see these wolf packs up in the shallows, they're usually up there feeding. If you can't find fish like that, it's a really good idea, as everybody knows, just to move deeper. And with smallmouth anyway, you're probably going to come across those fish, out as far sometimes as 50 or 60 feet. But somewhere along there, and often on a break or some kind of structure, there's an awful lot of movement depth-wise. And over the years, and I guess I'm combining my science and maybe some of my angling experiences, but I'm surprised sometimes how shallow fish can be. Some of the big fish that, you wouldn't necessarily think would be that shallow. And then, I think the deep thing a lot of people appreciate is sometimes a little harder to find, although with the electronics we have these days, it's getting a lot easier for a lot of people.
True story. Anthony Smith asked, how big do you think the biggest smallmouth is in Lake Ontario? If you're swinging for big fish, do you bank on a 10-pounder? Is it a 9-pounder? What's the record? Do we know that?
We were around when Lenny DeVos caught 1/8. off Kingston, smallmouth over 8 pounds. I know there's been 8s caught. I think the next threshold we're looking at is probably a 9-pound fish.
Yep.
Every year I get surprised. I was pretty shocked when the 8s started coming in. Just to kind of circle back to where we started from, for some people that haven't experienced it yet, that early season, I think what a lot of people have said, and you started off, and I didn't tee you up to say it, but during that early season, we're seeing a lot of fish that we don't seem to see at other times of the year, like giant fish.
Yeah.
And more of them. And so, I would say for people that haven't experienced this early season and are, thinking of trying to catch the biggest fish they've caught, that's a real good time of year to maybe come across that kind of a fish, because I know everybody that was out there that spent some time out there got into some really big fish.
I know there's a couple buddies of mine that are throwing their drinks at the screen right now saying, "Ben, don't encourage people to do this," but I gotta do it. If you can get out and do that early season fish, it is a mind-blowingly amazing experience. Unfortunately for Zone 20, that's where you're gonna have to come to do it. So it might be a drive for some people. You can fish up north though. There's a lot of open season up north, but I don't know. It was a pretty special fish for Zone 20 this year. And I can think of one guy's probably texting me right now saying, "Oh, I can't believe you did that." But and we can give people guidance. I mean, we're out there doing it all the time. So our sister store is High Falls Outfitters in Belleville. So if anybody has questions about it, stop by and see any of the staff there. They'll hook you up and they'll give you some guidance on how to do it. But it was an incredible opportunity that we got to thank you for lending a hand and bringing to us. But you're 100% right. It was easy, big fish catching action, and that's I think what we're all after.
Yeah, it might take a few days to figure it out, but they're there.
Well, I would share.
The other thing I'm going to give a plug for at the end here is what I have to say I really like about that early season is it's catch and immediate release.
Yeah.
So we're talking about fun fishing. Go out there and have some fun, but release those big fish right away. There's nothing that's allowing you to move those fish around. They're getting closer to where they're going to spawn. And so you got an opportunity to interact with them, but release them quickly. That's what the regulation's about. It's all based on conservation, and they are, going to be getting closer to their spawning areas. So, we want to have that interaction, but make it quick and let them go as quick as we can.
So we're saying chatterbaits, spin baits, swim baits. Anything else you want to throw in there? Shallow crankbait, maybe.
Yeah, and I have to say, in general, especially the smallmouth out there, they're looking down, feeding on gobies. If something's moving below them, that's the right size. There's a lot of things that'll work, and I think it's early days, so we're going to find out. You're going to find out there's a lot of things we hadn't thought of yet that are going to work too.
Yeah. So my experience was all moving, but you're saying cue in, hit the bottom, get your tubes out. Don't be afraid to do any of that too. Just play to their natural instinct for the smallmouth out there. And then I'll admit we were targeting largemouth with what we were doing. So running those big moving baits past them. I think we had to get a magic water temperature though. Is there a temperature range that you would say they think more active?
I think what we were looking for anyway was that few days that you're going to get where you get consistently warm temperatures and the shallows are starting to warm a little bit.
Yep.
So even if they can get into water that's a couple degrees warmer,
yep.
It makes a big difference in their activity levels and where they're going to be.
Yeah, we found that there was no point starting early in the morning. It was, later, start at 10 o'clock, fish till 3 kind of idea. Let that sun get up and heat up that shallow water, and you just go explore in your trolling motor, and you found them. Like it was, and you knew when you found them. It was good. So
it's also neat to see the habitat at that time of year. I have to say, you see a lot of stuff that you'd never see when it's covered with weeds or, the water's a little murkier. So,
yeah. Well, hey, we hit 8:45, so I I guess we'll ball out and eat cheesies for the rest of the night, and go home and enjoy. But I want to thank you for so many things. I want to thank you for spending some time with us tonight. I want to thank you for all the amazing stuff that you do. I know you travel around, you do conservation, everything that you do. It seems to always be committed to helping us as anglers and helping the fishery. So we all really appreciate that. You're just a super fantastic guy. So thank you from all of us. We really appreciate all that you do, Bruce.
Well, thanks. I enjoy it. People in my household say I don't have a real job, and it's kind of true because it's a lot of fun.
Well, that's the whole key, right? If you surround your life with good people and doing what you love to do every day, you never spend a day at work. So, okay. Well, thank you again for everybody who's just wrapping up. Shameless plug. Anybody who buys anything from TackleDepot.ca tonight, you're going to get in on a chance to win this Halo casting rod. We're just going to do a random draw from all the orders. And then we have the promotion on for the BaitFuel. Basically, if you buy any 3 packages of BaitFuel, you get a free buff, $15 value. That's thrown in. And of course, I think we got some free shipping promos and other things on for the store. So now's the time. I know it's coming quick. It won't be long till that ice is out and we all get to get out and hammer on the season we were talking about. So, and I want to throw an invite out, Bruce. If you want to come down and hop in the boat, we'd be happy to take you around and show you what we found, and then I can, hopefully weasel my way into some smallmouth fishing with you. So that'd be great.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, guys. Good night.